Welcome back to the Business Immigration Benchmark. I'm your host, Laura Blanears. Today, we are not talking about compliance, although compliance remains number one focus for our global mobility leaders given the immigration climate. Today, we're going to talk about successful global mobility program management through the lens of process and policy development. Now, of course, process and policy development will inevitably support compliance for your company. But today we want to look through that process protocol lens and how it impacts the foreign national or employee engagement. And so that's what we're really going to think about on this episode. We're going to put compliance aside for today and work through what does process and protocol look like for successful employee engagement. So, with that, we'll dive right in. From the legal side, often seeing how internal discussions develop, we see a lot of misalignment. And the misalignment comes from lack of protocols or lack of education for relevant stakeholders around the protocol. So, even if you have a protocol, if no one knows about it or knows how to implement it, then it's just like you don't have a protocol. In my experience, the employee or foreign national life cycle, the most important step is at the interview stage. So, where do teams get misaligned and how to fix it? I think, when we're considering how to approach process or protocol development, we're thinking employee needs a visa. The relevant teams need to go secure that visa and that relocation. The teams communicate the onboarding timeline. And that's where things fall apart, where expectations are not managed, timelines are blown, maybe costs are increased, and then everyone has a negative experience. So, what we need to do then is create a protocol from the very beginning for foreign national employees that are in the US and are supported by US recruiters. You want to make sure there's a strong protocol and a strong education around that protocol about how a recruiter engages in a pre hire assessment. So, the example here of what a successful protocol would look like is when the recruiter is educated on how to initiate a pre hire assessment, whether with an internal company immigration specialist to do the pre hire assessment or engage outside counsel to support a pre hire assessment. Our programs use our pre hire assessment tool. I really like it. It is the best that I have been working with throughout my career. It's all done through the system, which means the information all flows through our platform rapid and then can be reported. But in any event, no matter how you're doing the pre-hire assessment, we want to make sure that the recruiter is handing that off to the relevant attorney team or immigration specialist to review the foreign national candidates qualifications to understand whether the company can sponsor the candidate, the timeline to sponsor that candidate, any risks involved with supporting the sponsorship, and costs. Those are the typical data points that want to be included in the pre-hire assessment. So the hiring manager has all the relevant data points to understand if this candidate is the right fit for the business and how much it will cost to onboard that resource. It also really sets expectations so that, when an offer then is extended to that candidate, the business and the foreign national candidate have an understanding of how long it's going to take the teams to get the relevant work authorization in place to start off that candidate. And so that's where I see a lot of breakdown. I see a lot of breakdown in whether it's turnover of recruiting teams and hard to sort of educate the recruiting teams on the company's process. So if there is a process, it's often like the recruiter's unfamiliar with it or there's turnover, so the recruiters never really catch up into the process. And what that leads to is really disappointed candidates because their onboarding timelines are longer than the candidate expects because there's not been clear communication. And same thing on the business side, the manager doesn't have clear expectations on how long it will take to onboard the resource. And so if those aren't communicated up front through observance of a protocol, the manager and the business gets frustrated. In addition to potentially the business is not aware of the costs of sponsorship and so is hit with a bill unexpectedly. And of course, that's a negative experience. So, very key to look into developing a protocol. And if you already have a protocol, go through what your education or communication to the recruiting, talent acquisition teams look like, and do that on a relatively high frequency. I think twice a year is probably the minimum because, of course, there's turnover and timelines change, especially in US immigration. Something that might have taken just 2 weeks might take 4 weeks these days. So, good to have those refreshers and have some guides so that you have a playbook that everybody understands what's going on. The other breakdown I see with onboarding that leads to employee dissatisfaction or gaps in a global mobility program is that sometimes F1 students, so in the US, F1 students do not require employer sponsorship. So they may communicate to the recruiter or the manager, the hiring manager, that they don't require sponsorship. So there's sort of a miss here, and often it's just a naive answer or an unintentional wrong answer. The F1 student does eventually need sponsorship, but they may complete an employment or a candidate form that indicates they don't require sponsorship. And what that means is it might not trigger your recruiter protocol. And so the F1 onboards are able to show their EAD, they onboard with valid work authorization, but there's no protocol to sort of catch or backstop these F1s that onboard validly with EADs. And what I then see is a scramble in Q4 or Q1 for H-1B lottery season, where the global mobility leaders are not aware, not tracking these F1 students that will want H-1B lottery submission. The business will want to support them, but they just don't know that they exist. So what I recommend here is global mobility teams partner with the I-9 onboarding team, and that might be in the hands of global mobility, but sometimes it exists in a separate HR department, and get access to the I-9 reporting so you're able to see who's onboarding on a weekly basis. Because if, like I said, the F1 student onboards and doesn't indicate they need sponsorship, they're not put into a immigration tracking system. And so what I recommend here is creating a process or protocol that the global mobility or immigration specialist at the company has access to onboarding lists or onboarding reports that then the immigration specialist can screen for weekly onboarding of new hires to see if anyone needs to be, captured under a immigration report to be put into the lottery. Because what I've seen happen is when there isn't a backstop, these F1 students that are missed in the H-1B lottery have a very negative experience, risk losing work authorization, risk tenure with the company. So not only is the employee upset about the lack of process or protocol or transparency in the process, but the manager is also upset because their employee is disengaged or angry. So creating sort of a backstop program through I-9 reporting or onboarding reporting is really important. So yeah, we're talking about designing systems that provide structure and transparency. I think especially when we think about companies, and of course I'm sort of US centric here, I'm a US immigration attorney. I think about when companies are identifying talent at their companies outside the US and transferring them in. And those are usually L1 visas, but could be a smattering of other visa classifications to transfer those talented resources into the US. But when I think about the employee life cycle from abroad into the US, I think about how companies have done this successfully in mirroring how the business makes those decisions, identifies the talent to transfer into the US. And I think the successful systems from a global mobility standpoint mirror what the business process is and sort of layer in the immigration piece and then layer the relocation piece. Because it is really stressful for these employees to be managing a new life in a new country in addition to their career progression. Like I said, when I've seen this done successfully, the immigration and relocation piece is layered on top of what is already a successful sort of business strategy. And so this requires a lot of engagement from the global mobility to the, business stakeholders and specifically the business segments or business units that are requiring these transfers. A successful example I have worked with in the past is a company that really valued international mobility. So this was a French company. So they were headquartered in France. And as part of the career progression, they expected their employees to transfer to their other international hubs. So while headquartered in Paris, they had significant operations in Hong Kong and in Boston. And so to accelerate their careers within the company, directors, VPs were expected to move among the hubs. And so it was kind of the lifeblood of career progression within the company. And then they developed a very strong relocation program to mirror what was the career progression within the company. And so they had strong relocation packages, had strong engagement from all of their HR. So everyone was very familiar within the support structure of how relocation worked within their company. And they knew to lead with immigration. And then they knew that the relocation package came second once the visa was secured. So that was really cool. And that, those processes were developed, like I said, to mirror the business strategy. And that was done strongly. There was a lot of education around it. There was, frankly, a lot of investment in it, so that there was a smooth, transparent program that the internal stakeholders were managing in partnership with vendors. I think when we think about developing these processes, you're going to want to be surveying the HR leaders, surveying managers in how they think about the movement of employees. So in the example of the French company, that was sort of baked into career progression. I don't know that that happens at every company. When it breaks down, it's often I see that there's been like a side conversation that a manager has promised or an employee is looking to make a move and they don't know who to reach out to within the organization. And so they start having conversations with HR, with managers that aren't connecting to mobility. So I think global mobility, to add to your list of tasks, really needs to make sure the leaders of global mobility are visible within all departments of your global organization so that people know to reach out to you to start the conversation so that if there's not a, large relocation spirit within the company, they at least know the person to reach out to, and then global mobility leaders sort of engage the process that you've mapped out. Like I said, when things go wrong, it's when there's sort of side conversations, promises made, expectations managed in a way that has no basis in reality. So, for programs that have a large global presence as well as, presence in the US and move people around the world, revisiting how you're educating your business units on the process is really key because you might have a strong protocol, but it's only as strong as how well people understand that it exists. So, looking into visibility and how you're communicating the program would be a first step there. So hopefully that's helpful. We've been really focused on compliance these last several months. And I think if we take a step back and think about the process and protocol that, underlies your entire global mobility program is good because you want to make sure those pieces are in place both to support compliance, but also to support employee experience. Because as we all know, like your introduction to candidates is sort of the key to ensuring a successful employee experience and life cycle for that employee within your company. And that same thing when you're moving around tenured employees, you want to make sure their entrance into the relocation program is smooth because when that's not, those employees are stressed, their family feels stress, and they might disengage and ultimately terminate employment with your company, which would be a unsuccessful relocation or global mobility program. So the last piece to the process protocol is a feedback loop. So when you've completed your relocation, make sure there's internal surveys. I know as a vendor, we have surveys for our immigration piece, and I'm sure relocation providers have surveys, but maybe having a holistic survey or taking a pulse check on your relocation program might give you some insightful feedback in how to improve from a process and protocol and identify where the breakdowns are happening or how people are experiencing those process and protocol to see if there's any ways to improve the employee experience. So always something to do. I'm always adding, I feel like, to the task lists of my global mobility listeners, but just something to think about and a step away from compliance this week. We'll catch you next time on the Business Immigration Benchmark.